Hello and Merry Christmas. This is a very special episode of the Dualistic Unity podcast in that we are doing it intentionally for a Christian holiday. So don't go away. There's a reason. It's a special day, regardless of why it is a special day, not for the reasons that might be dictated by a religion, but because we collectively agree it's a special day because people who are Christian or not celebrate Christmas. And so since we're here together, we figured why not celebrate the day? Regardless what we call it, we are here together. So we decided to do this movie review.
Yes, Merry fucking Christmas. And it is a super fun time of year. And it's funny because it's definitely shifted over time for me. And even just the thought of, holidays in general, something to look forward to. Like I would look forward to Christmas for weeks, like all year. And then it was coming to just so much excitement and whatnot. And it's interesting, like how, I don't know, you start prioritizing your experience more and more. You stop distracting yourself from your experience by looking forward to things so much or being afraid of things, because all those really come down to are the assumption that I'm going to feel better at a future point or feel worse at a future point, feel, whatever in response to what's going on, and whatever side we fall on with that is either excitement for it, distraction from right now, or fear of it, distraction from right now. And so it's great to be here with you on Christmas, because there isn't really much else I'd want to be doing. Because what better thing to do on Christmas than to hang out and talk about a dope ass movie and the experience of being willing to be yourself and hanging out with people that you love.
And this really is a dope movie. There's a lot to this movie that I didn't necessarily appreciate when I first watched it. And in all honesty, I had an aversion to watching this movie because of the title. My life sucked for so long. I was so bitter about everything that a title like It's a Wonderful Life made me want to vomit. And so I just never got anywhere close to this movie until after I realized I wasn't who I thought I was, until after I started looking at life in a different way. I had seen it when I was younger, but I never watched it, if you know what I'm saying. And so we are going to be discussing the 1946 classic Frank Capra's It's a Wonderful Life, starring Jimmy Stewart and Donna Reed. If you haven't seen this movie yet, I highly recommend that you go and watch it now. It's Christmas Day. It's a perfect day to do it. Go and check it out and then come back and listen to this episode so we can bask in it together, because it's a dope story, and it's a dope story for a number of reasons. Now that you've watched the movie, I just want to discuss, first of all, the incredible graphics at the beginning of this movie when you see the galaxies talking to one another. It's 1946. Let's admit, I wouldn't know how to do that if I were to just try and do that with a regular camera and some Bristol board and maybe some colored paper and some lights. A lot went into that, and I appreciated it. I also appreciated how the angels were kind of dicks to Clarence. In specifically that Clarence has the IQ of a rabbit, but the faith of a child. And I really enjoyed that because he plays his role without overthinking it. He's not trying to make it about him necessarily. He's just playing his role because he has faith in that role. And so I thought he made a perfect addition to this story. Of course, we don't meet him until quite later on in the story. But let's just get into George Bailey, shall we? George Bailey is such a very interesting character. And what I love about George Bailey is that he has such giant ambitions. He wants to do great things for everyone, for the world. He wants to be involved in giant undertakings because he sees that as having the greatest impact. And yet underneath all that, he really does empathize with people from moment to moment to moment. And that empathy is ultimately what guides his decisions. And so it's so very interesting to see George looking to the future and suffering and being frustrated, while he is at the same time playing a role that if he were to look at it with clarity, he would gladly choose.
And it's interesting too, and just to, because we're going to be bouncing around all over the place, I'm sure, but when he goes to to jump off the bridge. And this is just kind of indicative of his character. Everything that he is one of the quotes from Bert. Says he never thinks about himself, God. That's why he's in trouble. That part when everyone's talking about all these things. And isn't it interesting that most of the movie he's doing things not putting himself first. He's putting everyone in front of himself, but he still has this underlying sort of maintenance of like what he wished he was doing, what he thought he should be doing, what he thought his life should look like. And it's always kind of under there, but it isn't strong enough to impact his decisions. And so when Bert says he never thinks about himself, God, that's why he's in trouble, it's interesting because basically the whole time he wasn't. But then as soon as he does, as soon as he starts coming up with this idea of how he wishes his life was or wanted his life to be, and it just doesn't match up with how he sees his life right now. It's like the moment he thinks about himself, which is the power of like our self-concept, is as soon as he does, he walks to a bridge to kill himself. And it's been festering under the surface for his life, kind of maintained as he's gone through. And it's interesting because as he's doing the things, there isn't any begrudgingness to him. And yet when he has time to think about it, there is. But any of the scenes where he's doing stuff for everyone else, whether it's, and we'll get into all of these, I'm sure, but like the bank run scene, jumping in to save his brother, all of those things, he's there in the moment. He's actually, enjoying the experience. Like they toast after the bank run, despite having no money left for the honeymoon, and they're laughing and having a great time. And so, but then, towards the end, as soon as he has that thought about himself, his opinion of how things should be relative to how they are, it's like it goes to the extreme of going to kill himself.
Well, and it's a build for sure. Like it's just one thing after another. First, he gets home, and there's the ball at the top of the stairway that consistently falls off. So you can see how that would be frustrating. And then his kid comes over and he says, "Hey, hey, Dad, have you seen the neighbor's new car?" And George feels threatened by that. It's like, what's wrong with our car? And then his daughter is sick, and it's because he feels they live in an old drafty house, and of course that reflects back on him, and it all just starts falling apart. And he starts looking at his whole life as if it was just all one big mistake, not in fact looking at all the relationships, at the fact that his children love him, not looking at his relationship with his wife or all of his friends or any of that. He's just looking at all of the evidence that he's a failure. And it's ultimately because things were falling apart. There was a massive change happening, and he couldn't figure out what else to do except blame himself, because he was so prone to taking things onto himself. There was a point where he was having a meltdown, and he was talking to Uncle Billy, and he's like, this is going to result in scandal and jail time, and I am not going down for you. And then later on, when he talks to Potter, he straight up says, I lost the money. So it was just a matter of time until George went back to being empathetic George, putting other people first. That was how Clarence saved his life. It wasn't by trying to stop him from jumping off the bridge. It was by jumping off the bridge himself, knowing that George would put him first.
And I really appreciated that side that you were talking about, Clarence and the God and the angels and everything before, but how much Clarence was just willing to be himself. And that was an extreme, like literally a leap of faith right there by Clarence. But understanding George and where his priorities lie, like it was the one that made sense. Like he couldn't have done anything else, couldn't have talked him out of it. He had to, do it to show him, and then show him everything that he was missing because he was focused on his opinion of himself. And the way that sort of skewed throughout his life was taking things on himself, which can then turn into focusing on himself and thinking, negatively about himself. Like he doesn't see the impact that he's having on everyone, despite putting everyone first the entire time. And so then showing him, his life without, you know, without him involved and like all of the impacts that he had, he starts to realize like, oh, maybe this perspective that I'm holding on to isn't just me, but it was like he was spending his entire life putting everyone else before himself. And yet, especially in the world that we're living in, we saw it reflected in different characters. I mean, we saw his dad very much being a reflection of that, of never thinking about himself, because so much of our thoughts about ourselves, our idea of ourselves, like we have to maintain that by thinking about ourselves, but that isn't just a conceptual thing. Like it plays into the actions that we take, the things that we do, how much I'm thinking about myself in the activity that I'm doing, which George basically never did when it came to the actual actions of things, but he was still able to conceptualize via his opinion of things on top of the actions.
There was a quote on the wall of his office by his dad that was really quite appropriate, which was, all you can take with you is that which you've given away. And that says a lot, not just about his dad, but about maturity as a whole. As you start to be able to put other people first, you start to see how much of an impact you are really leaving behind. It's not about you getting anything at all. And George really took that to heart. You could see, even when it came down to facing things, like he would look at that quote and kind of remind himself what he was doing when the bank run was happening. Right? This is something that helped him maintain that focus. And so George had that influence early on. Like, as you said, he saved his brother, and his dad recognized it when they were sitting down for dinner before the school dance. His dad said, "You were born older." And it's not that he was old, it's that he was mature enough to put other people first, to be sensitive, to be aware, as opposed to just focusing on himself all the time. And so I thought it was interesting that his dad recognized that. That said, now that I've brought up the dance scene, and I just want to remind everybody to check out that dance scene if you haven't yet. If you haven't watched the Charleston, it's a good scene. But that said, there is this moment. I've always wondered this, and if anybody can answer this question for me in the comment section, I will very much appreciate it, where George is dancing with Mary, and the guy that was trying to dance with Mary is kind of bitter and pissed off and sitting off to the side, glaring at George. And then this other guy comes over and he says, "Do you know that this place is built on top of a swimming pool? And do you further know that George is standing on the crack and that I have the key?" And I've always wondered to this day, who the fuck was that guy?
That is a great question, because as you just brought him up, I was going through that. Like, where did that motherfucker come from? Like, what is, like, there's some symbolism there. Just like, did he even exist? Was he just like the sort of devil on the guy's shoulder that just like appeared? Was he actually there? Or was he just a figment of the guy's imagination that like was able to explain something to him that was like in there, and an understanding that was in there? Yeah, exactly. Oh my god, that's fucking funny. And so that scene's just awesome, and just goes to show how much you can turn one thing into anything, like into something else. Like and there was kind of like I freaked out for a second because I didn't realize, like, I wasn't sure how far down the pool was. Like, I couldn't tell the depth, and I was like, are they about to like is this about to be this traumatic thing where like they both fall on their necks and the rest of the movie they're like in wheelchairs the whole time? Like, because this is the first time I'd seen it, so I was like, I was kind of on edge. Like, and they keep going back and forth and back, and they really build it up for you. And then they fall into the pool and they just keep dancing, and then everyone jumps in, and that I was just cracking up because it's all these people who are like, maybe a little bit more tense, rigid, whatever, and then they see them jump in, they're like, yeah, let's do it. And then it turns into this whole fucking crazy ass party. But that, I loved that scene. That was, yeah, in terms of like just subtle influence based on your response to a situation, is something that most people would think of as like, oh no, they fell in the pool, everyone got all dressed up for this thing. And it's like, is it about getting dressed up? Is it about looking great for everyone else, or is it about enjoying the experience? And what more fun of a thing could you do than in a dance where you didn't even maybe realize there was a pool? So then there's a pool and everyone's jumping in, everyone's diving in, having a great fucking time despite being soaking wet.
And it all came down to George's response to what was happening and Mary's response. And that's why Mary was such an incredible character, because while George was fixated on this ideal future, Mary was fixated on being with George, on George being happy in his life as it was. And so I thought that was great that she was just so incredibly supportive and at the same time empathetic to somebody who was showing empathy to everyone else. She genuinely appreciated it to the point where she willingly gave up all of their honeymoon money during the bank run. What kind of a person does that? Especially if that person's like, yeah, it's our honeymoon. This is something I've been looking forward to. Mary did in that moment what George was having problems doing for his entire story. She let go of the future. She let go of what she wanted. And that's what was eating at George the entire time, is that he wasn't getting what he wanted. He didn't have the life that he wanted. That's why when he looked at Sam Wainwright, he would get frustrated. He even kicked his car at one point when Sam kind of made the joke that, I offered to get George in on the ground floor of plastics. It's like, it's kind of a dick thing to say, but it wouldn't have frustrated George so much if he wasn't looking at his life as though he could have been more. And that's ultimately what Potter used against George when he finally did say, I've got to bring George down. I need to beat this now. And so he brings George in and he offers him a job. And then he starts talking to him about how frustrating it must be to be such an intelligent young man, more intelligent than all the rest, and yet to be limited in what you can do for yourself and your family. And he does all this. And you could see, like, this is exactly George's fears. And George agrees. He's like, yeah, this would be great. Oh my God. And he goes to shake his hand. And right there, as soon as he's in the moment, as soon as the moment is actually happening and he stops thinking about the future, he can tell this doesn't feel right. And I really enjoyed Potter's character in this movie. I don't know who the actor is, but he plays a fantastic slime ball for sure, right? And George described him very well. A scurvy little spider spinning webs with no sense of happiness, no sense of fulfillment. He has nothing to do except try to control everything. So everybody looks up to him or is afraid of him. So it's always about him. And that's why he was such a threat to Potter. That's why his dad was a threat to Potter, because his dad understood that it's working together that we remove the need for people like Potter, that we remove the environment that people like Potter can flourish in. And that's why I enjoyed the point of the building and loan, because the point of the building and loan was exactly what we were all under the impression that a bank was supposed to be about, right? You bring your money into the bank, that money gets lent out to other people in the community so that they can make more of their lives, and then you get a little bit back for your help, and everybody benefits. But that's not banking at all. The banking system doesn't run like that at all. But the building and loan did. And it's because it believed that we are better off working together, that we can hold each other up, that we do not need somebody above us all looking down, telling us what to do.
All said. Yeah. And I think they did a great job with Potter of just expressing, or him being symbolic of, a given mentality, like of just so focused on yourself and what you think is the right way, and just having control, having power, and yet having nothing in your experience, like just a shell of an experience, because there's never the consideration of anyone else, like ever. Like it doesn't cross his mind, and how much that's reflective of our collective mentality in so many ways. Like we're taught and brought up to like prioritize ourselves, and that's our downfall, is to think about ourselves, prioritize ourselves, what's best for me, what's right for me, entirely focused on that, thinking that that's where it's gonna get us to a point that we just think the right way about ourselves enough that we'd become happy. And you could see it in his character that he was just, I mean, he was just angry and grumpy all the time. It's like looking at his experience versus, George's experience, like he was smiling, laughing, having a good time most of the time. So what are we prioritizing? Are we prioritizing like how much control we seem to have, or are we prioritizing how free we feel, how relaxed we're able to feel? And the point, and one of the scenes, and this goes just like along with Mary and how awesome she was, but it was profound to me, the scene where when they first met when they were older, and leading up to that, how George was with, I think, Violet, and he's talking to her, and he's talking about all his like grand plans and how he wants to spend his life, and he's getting really like animated and into it, and like very much being himself, expressing himself, kind of like loose, dancing around. And her response is, boy, George, you sound crazy. What are you talking about? You can't do. And then kind of starts laughing at him, and then all of a sudden all these people pile in and like just start laughing about him just having a dream, a different perspective, some other way of living that isn't this, materialistic point of view that most people are maintaining, most people trying to be Potter. And so he leaves that situation, and it's just like, oh, fucking hey, you feel that so hard, because he went from like feeling great, just being himself, to just plummeting. And then you see it play out in the next scene with Mary, where she's just excited, so excited for him to be back. And he is grumpy as shit. And again, this is the first time I was watching it. So, like, I don't know how things play out at this point. I was like, fuck, no, no, dude. Just because I saw that it just stemmed from that situation where he's feeling all embarrassed and down. And then it's just expressed, put back on Mary, where he's just sitting on the couch, like, yeah, whatever, nothing. And just that being directly impacted by the scene before just hit home. And then, they talked to, what is his name, Sam Wainwright, and like eventually, obviously, hopefully you watch the movie and see things play out in a lot of different ways from there. But how indicative and how directly impacted he was. And a lot of times, there isn't someone like Mary there. And people just go through just one experience like that can have a ripple throughout someone's entire life. And it builds on that and builds on that and builds on that. And that grumpiness, that anger, that frustration that just stemmed from one situation, where you're feeling a little bit more relaxed, feeling pretty good, just sharing something that you want to share, just fucking plummets. And oftentimes that leads to a spiral. But it's just because you think that situation meant something about you, and see that those people were just as afraid, more afraid, and they had to lash out in some way, shape, or form.
Well said. It's interesting because there's a point where his dad is describing Potter and says he's sick in his mind, sick in his soul. He hates anyone who has what he can't have. And that is the sickness that George is fighting throughout the entire movie. That he is becoming more and more resentful about everybody who has the life that he can't have. He puts it off. He's supportive. He's empathetic. He loves the people in his life. But underlying all of that, there is this feeling that he should have been doing more. That he could have been rich and traveling like Sam Wainwright. He could have been doing any of these things. He could have went into the military and fought against the Nazis if it weren't for the fact that he damaged his ear saving his brother. So each and every time there's something that George would like to see himself being able to do, and each and every time it's a choice that he made for someone else that stops him from doing it. And so it's the thought, like, man, if I had just made different choices, and that's something that he says to Clarence at one point. He's like, yeah, money's important. It took me a long time to learn that, because up until then he hadn't been valuing money. He had been valuing his relationships. He had been valuing empathy, doing the right thing, connection, community, his family, all of it. And so all of a sudden now he's like, yeah, control, right? Control would have been really good. And it's like, but then you'd end up like Potter. who constantly needs more control, who doesn't have any of those connections. This is why I love the fact that at the end of the movie, George is literally called the richest man in town. And it has nothing to do with how much money he has, and everything to do with how many people he's impacted in his life just by putting himself next, or himself just by not putting himself first. It's a great movie. It really is quite good. And it brings us back to the point of today's special, Christmas, or rather, each and every day. Because what is the difference on Christmas? We think about others. And in thinking about others, we feel better. Now, that's not to say that everybody does, because God knows there's a lot of people out there that are thinking, well, what am I going to get on Christmas Day? I didn't get the gift I wanted. Oh, what? This is cheap. Like, there's all kinds of people who would think like that. But for those who are in the spirit of the day, for the sake of embodying empathy and generosity, there's nothing better. It's a beautiful day. It's a fantastic day because we choose to make it so. So much so that during World War I, soldiers stopped fighting on Christmas Day and walked across the field to share in one another's campsites because they chose it so. And then the next day they went back to murdering one another because they were told to by the powers that be. But they didn't have to. Every day we can make that choice. Every day we can choose to not put ourselves first. And it's not for the sake of others. It's for the sake of faith. It's for the sake of playing our part. It's for the sake of enjoying our life and being where we are. And that's where connection is.
And it's interesting how much, like, on Christmas or any situation, where there's possibly gifts involved. Like, I don't, maybe this isn't for everyone, but like, I know I feel way better giving a gift than getting one. Like, there's a feeling that goes with it. And part of me is almost like sometimes judgmental. It's like, what do should I feel that good about? Like, am I doing it to feel good about myself? And it's like, no, it's in response to, it's like, every time you do something for someone else, it's like a dropping of a weight to some degree. And like, we're wondering how to live free, how to live without weight. Like, is it just putting others first and not for the sake of being something or how you look, but just because there isn't the weight that comes with it, and you see that there is the potential for influence when you do so. Like, how much fucking influence could you have if you focused not on someone else necessarily specifically for your own gain, but just put others first? Like, the amount of impact and the lack of concern or fear because things don't mean anything about you. And so much of it comes down to your actions and the things that you do. It's not just not thinking about yourself so much conceptually. It's not thinking about yourself so much, period. And that's kind of uncomfortable in the world that we're living in right now. But as you do it more, you start to realize, oh shit, there is a lot less weight here. This does feel good. Like, there's an inherently good feeling to it. And I hesitate to use the word good, but like that empathy, like and this is like, oh God, this is like, it's funny for me to like just realize it. And I think there were parts of this movie that were uncomfortable. And I think for anyone who acts selfishly to some degree, and I know everyone is on a spectrum of that, but to see that and just be willing to realize like, oh, maybe that is what this is all about, is putting others first. Because then that plays out in so many different ways. And yet, as soon as, it becomes about you or what you think or wish should be happening or want to be happening, then, you end up very quickly can end up in a very depressive state because you believe that that's the truth, and discount. It's like that's all you can then see, and you discount everything that's happened for that. But yeah, it's a powerful time of the year for sure, because it's like we can realize that on a day, but we discount how that's how we can live in a lot of ways. We think it can only happen on Christmas, but we don't realize what impact that has then on us in our experience. And, the things that we psychologically suffer through change as our actions start to change.
Man, isn't that true? Right? How many people experience some depression after Christmas? Or how many people start to feel a high as you get closer to Christmas? And it's exactly the same kind of sickness that George is going through and that old man Potter is suffering from. They're looking to the future, to what's going to make them happy, what's going to give them control, what's going to make them more, right? Instead of living today. And it's so interesting because when you do get caught up in that trajectory to an endpoint where you are more, that is obviously the right path, then you judge everybody else who's not on that path. And Potter's a perfect example of that. What was he saying when they were talking about shutting down the building and loan after George's dad died? And he was saying like, oh, this building serves no purpose. It does nothing except give people houses when they should be out there saving and scrimping and doing all of that. And George was saying, scrimping and saving for what? Like, for what? Like, they can't afford to live in a house and live their life? Like, what is exactly that they're hoping for when we can all just use our money together? And Potter's response, those aren't my children. It's not with my money. I should give it to miserable failures. Like, you could see how much judgment, and it's because he put himself up on this fucking pinnacle. And that's how he wanted to be perceived. So much so that at the beginning of the movie, when Clarence sees Potter for the first time, he refers to him as a king.
Oh man, I forgot that reference there. But and how much that focus too for Potter, like in that, like if you believe that you're living the right way, like you gotta judge, you gotta maintain these perspectives. Like if you're maintaining this perspective of yourself being correct, like everyone who isn't doing that, anyone who's expressing things differently or living a different way, or running a business that isn't the way you would run it because it has a different priority. It's not about maximizing profit, making the most money. Because then it's like you keep looking at that and you're like, all right, make the most money for what? So you can get more stuff for you and, become less and less involved in reality. Like you go so far that you're just kind of by yourself and not really by choice, because you just keep creating this idea of the right way, the correct way to be. And then you get further and further from reality, obviously, but like further and further from other people. And a lot of it could be out of fear. A lot of it is out of fear for being seen for who or what you are. And so much of that, like running for control, what Potter expresses is like, a way to suppress the self-hatred in a lot of ways. Like you almost don't really think of it like that at first, but that it's like a big old wall that keeps getting built. The more I have, the further I am from myself. Like the further I am from others, the more disconnected I am from everything else, the higher I feel. It's like we prioritize like being on the highest fucking, I don't know, pole, looking down on everyone else, being the best thing, and yet being so far from everyone, being so far from what's actually going on. You don't even see what's going on the ground because you're maintaining this perspective that it's like, I feel good about myself. Like, and like, what do you have to show for it? You're all the way fucking up there. You're not even doing anything besides sitting on a fucking pole, 1,000 feet up in the air.
But I'm high up in the air, so therefore I'm better. I must be happy if I'm this high up. Yeah, because you're not this high up, and it's that whole comparison game. And it's so very interesting to watch because over and over and over again, George just keeps making choices that quite obviously are going to have an impact over time with the people that he's interacting with. Old man Gower, the pharmacist, right? That's a perfect example. Of course, Harry saving that boat full of soldiers, that whole boat full of soldiers. They would have died otherwise, which may have cost the war. I mean, they could have taken that way farther in terms of that, but not just that. But there was also a moment where, of course, George is at Mary's house when he's all frustrated, and I loved the scene, by the way, where he leaves talking to Violet and he goes to see Mary, and everything's so fucking annoying that even the gate won't fucking open. Like he's just struggling with it so much. Anyway, in that scene, they're on the phone with Sam, and Sam is saying, like, yeah, we're gonna buy a factory out in Rochester. And George is like, why Rochester? There's a factory here that you could get for dirt cheap, and it's going to create a lot of jobs. So even right there, George is thinking about the town because he didn't make any money on that whatsoever. He's just thinking about the town. And how many people in that town are now employed because of that one thing that George did without thinking about himself whatsoever? And so all of these little impacts throughout George's life were huge impacts when played out over time. And that's true for all of us. It's true for all of us. And this is why it's so important not to make Christmas important, but to make the mentality that we embody on Christmas important. Because then it's not about the day and it's about us. And that changes the ripple that we make all year round. And what's great about it is you don't spend all year wishing for Christmas to come because you are carrying it with you.
Well said. It's funny we call it the season of giving, as if it can only be siloed to a season, right? Who's to say that it can't be all year round? And who's to say that wouldn't have a drastic impact on your life, on my life, to not think of it as a day or a season or a month, but think of it as a life that you can live and to try it out. Like we know how it feels giving someone a gift, doing something for someone else, setting ourselves aside. Like we all have experiences where we do that and we discount how that feels for us too. Like most of the time when we're thinking about situations that we have enjoyed or appreciated the most, it's not from prioritizing ourselves. It's from setting ourselves aside, turning that season of giving into a lifetime of it, because it's in potential for anyone. No one can tell you how to do it or force you to do it by any means, but the opportunity is there, even just to test the waters.
Enough ripples change the entire pond.
And one of my favorite parts, and the parts that made the waterworks start kicking in, was at the end there when he doesn't have the money to cover the stuff because he had essentially given so much of it away, and then the people start shuffling in to the bank, and one person after another is giving money to support him. And that was it hit me when I think one person gave in and I started to feel, the tingles. It's like, oh boy. Oh, this is fucking incredible. And then someone else comes in and then it's just waterworks, and then they kind of settled and someone else walked in. Oh my God. Because it's so fucking powerful. And that's the thing, is like that faith, and not even realizing, like, you don't know how that stuff comes back around, but you're always interacting with yourself. And so of course it comes around. It's not karma in the sense that you put it in and something comes out. It's karma in the sense that you're always interacting with yourself. And to see that, and then the bank examiner to be this close to, like, fucking George over, and then he's just like, as a shift, and he's like, wait a second, this part is pretty dope. And then he just starts dancing and just joins in and tosses his fucking papers, or gives up on whatever thing he came to do to make George pay for not having money to cover it, because he's got the money. And then you see that shift. But the ripple that can have in a town, in a world makes you wonder what sort of ripples selflessness and altruism can really have.
This has been a fantastic Christmas episode. I've really enjoyed this conversation. I'm really grateful that we were here to spend some time with you today on what we laughingly call Christmas, or even December 25th. We're just happy to be here with you. We're happy that you are out there doing what you're doing, because you have as much impact as any of us. So have a fantastic Christmas and happy holidays.
Merry Christmas and happy holidays, motherfucker.